It really is a great pleasure to be back with you. And I'm not going to read a script tonight. I'm going to chat to you about Korea and the latest book that Richard and I have written together. It's our second one. How did I fall into writing a book with a chap who was the Chief of the General Staff? Well, he told me to, basically. I was a major when I left the army, and he was a general, and he rang me up one day, about 2010. It's a long story. I won't bore you too much with it, but I ended up helping him write his biography, which is a great book, by the way, Boots on Leading from the Front, rather. He then subsequently wrote Boots on the Ground, which is a history of the British Army from 1945. And then at the start of lockdown, he rang me up out of the blue and said, what about another collaboration? And that collaboration led to this book here, A Victory to Defeat. I've got 8 copies for you tonight. I really don't want to take any home. I've spent the whole afternoon mastering Zettel. So get your credit cards out, and all you do, frankly, is you just tap it. It's quite amazing. Technology is absolutely extraordinary. Because I know that you came along without any cash in your wallets, because that's the standard excuse. That Max, I'm not a Max Hastings, but Max always insists on cash. I've got a Zettel. It's absolutely incredible. I hope it works. Anyway, so we wrote this book, Victory Defeat, which is the extraordinary story of the British Army between 1918, when it stabbed Ludendorff's army in the chest. Don't believe this nonsense that German army was stabbed in the back by Jews and communists in the 1920s and 30s. It was stabbed in the chest by the British Army. Ludendorff's army was defeated by the British Army. An extraordinary story. If you don't believe me, it's not just our book. There are lots of other books I can introduce you to that will demonstrate the proof of that argument. But by 1940, we had forgotten how to fight. We'd forgotten how to fight a high-intense campaign against a peer adversary. And when we were hit by the Wehrmacht in all its glory in 1940, we had no idea what was happening to us. So it's not simply a matter of failing to prepare for the next war. It was failing to understand how an enemy might prepare for the next war. Because whilst we forgot the lessons of 1918, by goodness gracious me, the Germans didn't. And they went off to Russia. They spent most of the 1920s and 30s with whistles and flags in Russia, learning the lessons of the 100 Days campaign. Richard and I started writing that in 2020 because we were convinced, both ex-soldiers, that the way in which the government was treating the army, we were simply revisiting the past. We had not learned the lessons of the past. And the fundamental lesson of the past is the army is not just a fire brigade. It's not something that you pull out of the building when a house in Salisbury is on fire. It's something that you have because it itself is an essential deterrent to bad behavior. If a country looks at the United Kingdom and says, bloody hell, I've got a really tough army there, I'm not going to do anything, because if they fly in 1936 into the Rhineland and I've just demilitarized, I've just sent my legions marching in, if the British turn up with an airborne division or an armored division and stop me, I'm going to turn around. And we're not going to have the Second World War, because that's exactly the situation in 1936. If Britain had responded to the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, we're convinced we would not have had the Second World War. We didn't do it because we didn't have the army capable of going back into the Rhineland and forcing the issue with Hitler. We also didn't have the political will. So you need the two things together. You need the army able to do great things, and you need the political will to use the army in the defense of our national interest. And those two things, not just the politicians, and no use blaming the politicians, sitting here in Salisbury and slagging off the politicians. I do it all the time. But it's no point doing that, because the politicians represent what you think and what you vote for. Okay? Sermon over. It was quite a cautionary tale. When we got to the end of that book, we were actually quite depressed. We needed counselling. So we had a 100-year-old Margot that cost about £2,000, and that rescued us. I'm joking. We then, during the construction of that book, Victory Defeat, On the 22nd of February 2022, what happened? 22nd of February 2022, what happened? The special military operation. So we were sitting actually in the House of Lords where he lives during the week, and I'm summoned to help whiteboard and write this jolly book. And we tracked for the next year, the final year of our book together, what was happening in Ukraine. And he had the benefit of some regular briefings in Whitehall on the situation in Ukraine. And during that process, we asked ourselves, isn't it interesting to see how history reinvents itself? This war is very similar to lots of other wars. The way in which the Ukraine war began is very similar to the Korean War. The way in which we think the Ukraine war will end is very similar to the war in Korea. So long before that book was published, we looked at each other and said, okay, we'll go and write a book on Korea as well. So that's where this book came from. Korea War Without End came from a desire to try to understand a misunderstood war in the context, frankly, of what's happening now. And we started by, I mean, it's very interesting, we were very honest with ourselves. As ex-soldiers, anyone who's served in the military here will attest, we were all taught, weren't we, that this was a good war. This was a limited war. This was a war it was a proxy war between East and West. And it kept the world safe because we learnt how to fight without using nuclear weapons. Well, Richard and I, in the construction of this book, realized that that's a fantastic lie. We came very, very, very close to nuclear Armageddon in April 1951, let me assure you. America had 369 atomic bombs at that stage, and I would say the majority of people in Washington were quite happy to lob them at China. If they'd done that, Russia would have lobbed a few in our direction, and we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. The world would have fried, frankly, in April 1951. So the war was only a limited one by accident. And Richard and I sat down to try to understand why it was that the war started, how was it prosecuted, is there anything that we can learn from the way in which the war was conducted that might help us thinking about war today? More importantly, how did the war come to an end? Is there any hope for Ukraine? How did the imbroglio in Korea come to an end? And indeed, did it come to an end? And that's the purpose behind writing the book. It's not a traditional military history. It was very interesting when we submitted the manuscript to Bloomsbury and we shook hands and we congratulated ourselves on writing another book because it might look easy. It's a pain in the neck. It's quite hard. The first response was from Bloomsbury, our lovely editor, who said, there's not enough war in it. There's not enough battle in it. There's too much analysis. You're spending all your time asking questions and answering those questions about why it was that people went to war, what they did when they were at war, and how it ended. And I said, that's the purpose of the book. But they wanted a little bit more. And so we chucked a little bit of battle in. So there are now 3 prologues. And the prologues, they're actually quite helpful, I think, because when you read the prologues for each of the 3 parts of the book, you'll see that we're introducing the nature of the fighting. And there's a whole chapter, a fabulous chapter that we've lifted from the memoirs of a Gloucester veteran called Dennis Watmore. His lovely daughter, Dame Sarah Watmore, gave us permission to put this in. He was one of the survivors of D Company of the Gloucesters, who I won't tell you too much of the story now, you need to read it, but it's quite an extraordinary story. Not all the Gloucesters got out, of course, many Gloucesters were taken prisoner. He and his fellows, under quite a remarkable company commander, decided to retreat from the Imjin River position. By the way, the Imjin River, I mean, I hesitate to say this, but I spent my military career slightly suspicious of the Imjin River. Was it really as important as everyone made it out to be? Yes, it stopped the 6th Chinese offensive. There were 7 in total into Korea. It was really quite a remarkable battle, a very, very important battle that men of the 27th Commonwealth Brigade enacted, not just the Gloucesters. And anyway, this company commander decided to take his men, they'd run out of ammunition, into the Chinese lines and retreat through the Chinese lines to a position of safety. Really quite a ballsy action, and most of the men survived. So that's why there's quite a bit of battle. It's a book with a bit of battle in order to be able to frame the context of the decision-making that I think is really, really fascinating. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this today. The first thing to show you is this map, and it's interesting. If you just Google maps of the war in Korea, you get this sort of rubbish. It's really quite extraordinary how much people just don't understand about the war in Korea. So what's really interesting about this? What are the phases of the Korean War? Well, if you look at this, you might say, oh, okay, there were 4 phases of the Korean War. The first thing is that the communists rushed down to the Pusan perimeter, and they did. And then we have a counterattack from Pusan and Incheon, and we rushed up to the Yalu River, we did. And then the Chinese counterattacked, they did. And then there was a sort of a battle for the demarcation line. It's only partly true. What's really important, Richard and I we had a Damascene moment, always really exciting having a Damascene moment. The light bulb literally comes on. And we realized there wasn't a single Korean War. There were 2 Korean Wars. What do I mean? Well, when you try to understand war, when you try to understand what happened and why, it's really important to try to compartmentalize the war into its natural segments. And Korea has 2 natural segments. And Rich and I are quite pleased that no one else has picked this up. The 2 natural segments were, first of all, the invasion by the North, a chap called Kim Il-sung. It wasn't his real name, it was a pseudonym, who was the leader, the glorious leader of North Korea, People's Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, neither democratic nor people's, definitely of Korea. The attack by Kim Il-sung on the 25th of June, 1950, into the south. And that war ended when a quite brilliant counterstroke at Incheon destroyed the North Koreans in October. So from June, July, August, September, October, 1950, we had an invasion of South Korea by the North, and we then had the wrapping up of that war by October. The war was over. The status quo antebellum had been achieved, i.e. the point at which geographically the war had started had been reverted to in mid-October 1950. So the war was over. That's the first war. Then an extraordinary set of circumstances allowed the Americans, in a period of what Richard called unthinking. We're trying to understand why on earth the Americans did this, but it's really just a period of unthinking. Very, very quickly decided that since the North Koreans had been defeated, the whole of North Korea now lay open, and all it needed was for the Americans and their foreign lackeys, as the running dogs, as the Chinese called the Brits, all they needed to do was to occupy North Korea, and it would all be hunky-dory and would be home by Christmas. When does Christmas come? December, isn't it? October. October is the start of winter. And a decision was made in October 1950 by not MacArthur. Everyone blames MacArthur for this nonsense. It actually came from President Truman, the American president, and Washington, who in a moment of unthinking thought, well, all we need to do is occupy North Korea. Just get up to the Yalu. The North Koreans are defeated. And all you need to do is occupy. Once you occupy, we'll reunite Korea under a chap called Syngman Rhee, who was the leader of the South Koreans in Seoul. And the war will be over and we'll all be home by Christmas. And you know, of course, because you're all astute observers of the human condition, and you're also astute historians, that it didn't end like that. And we had a situation where an unforeseen event took place. That unforeseen event was the intervention in Korea of the Chinese. And that started the Second Korean War. And the Second Korean War was a bit of a seesaw war. It started off as a seesaw war, then it ended up in a bit of a stalemate for good reasons. And So the second war for Korea, the Second Korean War, began in mid-October when the Americans were authorized to race to the Yalu. And as winter encroached, they basically drove north in not a tactical, not tactical formations. In fact, the army was divided in two parts. 10 corps sat on the right-hand side of North Korea and moved north in a lackadaisical manner. And the remainder of the army moved on the left. There was no coordination between the two. After all, they were simply going to occupy North Korea and hand it over to Syngman Rhee. What's not to like? Very, very simple. But of course, we then had this event where the Chinese decided that it was not in their interests for their neighbors to be occupied by the Americans, and they intervened in very, very large numbers. And we had a series of offensives by the Chinese army, rapidly reinforcing itself from October onwards, October all the way through to the following April 1951, where the Chinese pushed the Americans and the British, and there are 18 members of the United Nations actually involved in the Korean War, pushed them all the way back past Seoul, past the Han River, and deep into Korea itself. So, which is this point here. So, oops-a-daisy, I'm doing something. Let's just go back. There we are. Back to here. And the reality is, instead of having 4 phases for the Korean War, we really only need 2. The first war, the invasion, and the American and United Nations response, and the second, which was the American overreach into the north, and the Chinese response. The first war was a war essentially between America and the North Koreans, and the Republic of Korea as well. The second war was a war between the United Nations and China. And it's quite extraordinary talking to Americans about this. The concept that America has been at war with China has completely missed 99.9% of Americans living today. This lack of historical context in which their culture thrives does not accept that America and China have been at war in the past. Maybe if they did understand that, they might have a slightly different perspective on things. But that's the first most important thing. There were 2 completely different wars for Korea. I would say that the first war, when it was initiated, was a war to right a wrong. If you speak to major ethicists at University of Oxford, like Professor Nigel Biggar, he will argue, as he does in his books and his lectures, that war, to be justified, needs to be proportionate. It needs to reverse a wrong. The idea that war is completely illegal has no status actually in international law. But there is a presumption in the United Nations, because the United Nations was established to protect the sovereign integrity of nations, that the only reason why you might fight another country is in self-defense. And if you wage aggressive war, it's not done, old chap. It's not illegal, but it's not done. And it's very interesting when you look at the Korean War. Truman's first response when he heard that the North Koreans had invaded the South, this was over a weekend, was, I don't want a rerun of 1938. And fascinatingly, Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister in London at the time, wrote in his diary, I'm paraphrasing here, that he did not want to be seen as a Tory appeaser. Again, going back to 1938. So he and Truman needed to be seen to act against these threats against the sovereignty of nations and to uphold the rule of law as the United Nations had interpreted it. So 1950, really, really important moment in the history of the world, when the free world responded against this aggression that was a rerun of what Hitler had been doing in Europe since 1936 and the remilitarization of the Rhineland. So history is really important. It was really important to Truman. It was really important to Clement Attlee, and they responded viscerally to this aggression. And you can understand why. 1950, the biggest war the world has ever seen, 70 million dead. The world had bombed itself to oblivion, essentially. We'd impoverished ourselves in the United Kingdom. We'd put ourselves back 100 years. And here we have war again bursting out. Very interestingly enough, when Clement Attlee was discussing the morning after the invasion, the 26th of June, with members of his cabinet secretary said to him, "Sir, it's a distant obligation." And Clement Attlee immediately responded and said, "It's an obligation nevertheless." He got the importance of this. Some of you will hear or echoed in Clement Attlee's response the claim by the Prime Minister in 1938 that Czechoslovakia was a country that was a long way away and of which we knew very little. It was still an obligation, and an obligation we ignored. We appeased Hitler over Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain led the charge in that particular campaign. That wasn't going to happen to Clement Attlee. So it's very, very important to understand our context. So here we are, two phases of the Korean War. The Second Korean War, let me quickly summarize, was a war in which the unsuspecting Americans, the Republic of Korea, and Brits and a few others were completely shaken out of their complacency by Chinese intervention. Nearly 2 million Chinese turned up and said, "We're not going to have this," pushed the United Nations forces back behind the Han River, which runs parallel to Seoul, and very, very nearly the United States, the United Nations, lost the war there and then. For a number of very good reasons, not least of all the appointment of a brilliant American commander called Matthew B. Ridgway. Some of you will know that I regard General Bill Slim to be the best British general of all time. British or American, doesn't matter. Beats the Germans hands down. Quite extraordinary guy. Ridgway is the American Slim. He really was an extraordinary guy. He put heart back into the armies in Korea, fought a battle to draw the Chinese to a stop, and then spent the next 2 years rather, from July 1951 to July 1953, along effectively the 38th parallel, to persuade the Chinese that they could not achieve their military objectives by force. And very interestingly, this was an attritional war. This is very, very similar to 1915 to 17 on the Western Front. It was an artillery war, but it was a war in which the West decided that it didn't want to mount any further offensives into the north. It was prepared to fight a battle on the 38th parallel. Why? Because it wanted to bleed the Chinese white. It wanted to demonstrate to the Chinese that they could not unite the whole of Korea under communism by force. And as military historians, as ex-soldiers, it was a very, very useful exercise or lesson for Richard and I to contemplate the importance of battle. Battle can have strategic consequences. And Matthew B. Ridgway's defense of the 38th parallel between July 1951 and July 1953 was incredibly important. He won the battle. It was a battle in which the Chinese could not get across the 38th parallel. Why was that battle so critically important? I'm going to let you all out of your misery. The battle was critically important because it prevented escalation. And this is where we come to the point about limited war. I've been taught many times in my military career that Korea was the archetypal limited war. And I always came away from, whenever I was taught that, with a nice warm glow, thinking we were very good. We deliberately limited it, and we made sure it didn't go atomic. It's complete nonsense. It was a limited war because Matthew B. Ridgway enabled it to be so. By so fighting his forces, he enabled Washington not to have to resort to the use of nuclear weapons. Now, during this whole time, it actually began in April 1951. Actually, in truth be told, it began a bit earlier than that. We had Matthew B. Ridgway's predecessor, Douglas MacArthur, who was the great hero of the Pacific War, quite an extraordinary campaigner. The South Pacific Campaign in the Second World War was an extraordinary island-hopping campaign that that he designed and executed quite brilliantly. He, in October 1950, this is MacArthur, thought through and pressed on a reluctant US Navy, reluctant US Marines, and a very reluctant US Army to mount an operation against Incheon and to cut the North Koreans off. The North Koreans, by this time, the North Korean People's Army was deep in the south, and the Incheon operation cut them off and destroyed them at a stroke. Really quite an extraordinary operational war. But MacArthur was then responsible for sending his troops in this race to the Yalu. And after being battered back, started to panic about the ability or the lack of ability of his armies to stop the Chinese. And very quickly, in early 1951, MacArthur lost confidence in his armies to stop the Chinese. Now, if you're a general and you lose confidence in your armies, what do? You look for the big red button that says nuke on it, because it's the only thing that's going to stop you being defeated by the Chinese hordes. And that's exactly what MacArthur did. MacArthur started badgering Truman and the powers that be, including Congress, quite outrageously, started lobbying people in Congress to use nuclear weapons against China. Just imagine that, 369 atomic bombs being lobbed against China. MacArthur simply saw these as big lumps of TNT. Each atomic bomb had the explosive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. What's a nuclear bomb? It's simply, or an atomic bomb as they called it in those days, it's simply a really efficient way of throwing TNT at the bad guys. And we very, very, very nearly came to war in 1951, because I would say the majority of political and military opinion in Washington supported MacArthur and supported his demand to send B-29s across the border into China and to bomb Chinese cities, and also then to use nuclear weapons. The war was limited because Matthew B. Ridgway was able to use his military forces to prevent an escalation. Korea became a limited war by accident, and that's really one of the most extraordinary things that we discovered. I've spent way too long describing all of that, but you should have a good sense now that actually there were two very, very different wars for Korea. One, a good war in which aggression was countered by the West. It was proportionate, it was disciplined, it was effective. And the second war in which the West lost its head, and as a consequence of hubris, arrogance, decided it would occupy North Korea and achieve a political settlement at no cost, without taking into account all the noises coming from China that said, remember, China had become communist the previous October 1949. Mao Zedong had won his civil war, that said, if a single American boot goes into North Korea, we're going to be coming into North Korea to push you out. And they did. So, what I just want to do is talk about some of the things that really struck Richard and I as we prepared the book. The first to note is Korea's really remarkable history, and I think one of the downsides of modern military accounts of Korea, I say modern, we're the first book published in Britain to consider the strategic story of the Korean War since the official history was published in 1995, so 30 years. It's quite extraordinary. It is a forgotten war, certainly by historians. But it's the context of the of Korea as a country is largely forgotten by people who come in and study the war. And I'm sending some fiery darts at some American historians, military historians, who don't treat the culture of the country with enough respect when they consider the war. And it's the same with any war. When you're writing a history of any war, you need to start with who are the people, What do they believe? Where do they come from? What's their experience of life and of war and so on? The armies that operate in the field of battle are products of that culture, products of the people, products of you and I. The point about Korea was that Korea had a unique and integrated culture for 1,000 years prior to 1910, when the Japanese trooped in and grabbed the whole of Korea, kicking and screaming, and brought it into the burgeoning Japanese empire, an empire that began really in 1868 with the Emperor Meiji. We don't have time to go into that today, but 1,000 years of history, 1,000 years of language and of culture and of religion was destroyed in a matter of weeks and months by the arriving Japanese, who insisted that everyone spoke Japanese, who inserted Japanese civil servants right across the country. In order to get a job, you needed to have been taught Japanese, and you needed to basically bow to Tokyo. And that remained the case until 1945. Many of you will know that the conscripted Koreans played a very significant part in the Japanese forces in the Second World War. But it's really quite extraordinary, because when in 1945 the Allies decided to disarm the Japanese in Korea, the Russians agreed to an American request to disarm the Japanese above the 38th parallel, simply a line drawn across the country, and the Americans would disarm the Japanese in the south. That's the only reason the Americans and the Soviets rather than the Americans were in Korea, to disarm the Japanese. But of course, Joseph Stalin had other ideas, and he was merrily creating buffer states around the USSR, and he determined that he was going to stay, and he was going to put his own people in power, and he put in charge this chap Kim Il-sung. And from the very beginning in the north, the communist regime preached this message that if you were in the south, and if you supported capitalism, if you supported democracy, if you supported the regime of Syngman Rhee, you were pro-Japanese. It's quite a subtle argument, isn't it? You're collaborators, you're not proper Koreans. And that argument, unbelievably, exists today. The North regards the South as people who a whole people who have suffered and are suffering from Stockholm Syndrome as a consequence of being captured by the Japanese. They regard them as Japanese collaborators. And in Korean, that accusation is still bandied about. You're Japanese, you're not a proper Korean. And of course, the lie was allowed to develop that only the North Koreans and only the regime established by the Kim family was truly a product or a legacy of the chosen regime. That's the first point. Korea had a rich and complex history before the war began. The war began not because Joe Stalin wanted to go to war with America. We now know, in fact, we learnt this at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, when a number of the Soviet archives were opened up, that Joe Stalin did not want to fight the Americans in 1950. But Kim Il-sung was already planting, building up rather, his structures of familial power. You know, his family had taken control of North Korea, and he was embedding his family and his mates into positions of authority. And he believed that if he persuaded himself that Korea could be united in a lightning attack that mirrored Zhukov's attack in August 1945 into Manchuria, that was itself a mirror of the German blitzkrieg into France in 1950. And he basically misinterpreted what was going on in the South, and he misinterpreted the world. So you remember when I described Truman and Attlee's visceral reaction to this story, to the news breaking that North Korea had invaded the South. There's no way the world could stand by and let this aggression stand. Kim Il-sung had no concept of those attitudes. He had not considered that, because he was not particularly well educated, he had no understanding of how how the Second World War had begun, and didn't understand this concept of appeasement, only saw the war in North Korea through his own lenses, which is a desperately daft thing to be if you're going to launch a massive war of this nature. So the war began as a consequence of hubris by Kim Il-sung, but Kim Il-sung, of course, was supported by the Soviets, and he was supported by Mao Zedong. Basically, Stalin, who died in March 1953, and Mao Zedong both said, okay, stop badgering us. We'll support you, oh Kim, so long as you guarantee victory. Are you sure the Americans aren't going to come in? And Kim said, why would the Americans come in? Well, Kim also didn't understand the concept of collective defense. Well, we didn't actually in Britain until 1949 either. Actually, after 1939, we did understand it, but the first time that we in Britain signed a collective defense agreement that committed ourselves to a continental commitment was NATO in 1949. Some purists will argue it was the Western European Union a few years before then, but let's just go with NATO because everyone understands it. And collective defense, Article 5, is basically a commitment by everyone in NATO to come to the defense of their neighbors if their neighbor is attacked for any reason. That's collective defense. What Kim Il-sung didn't understand is that when the American army had left Korea in late 1949 and early 1950, South Korea had, not secretly, they hadn't publicized it because they didn't think it was necessary, and America didn't publicize it because they didn't think it was necessary, signed a collective defense agreement between the two countries, so that if the South was attacked by the North, the Americans were obligated legally to respond. Now, the Americans didn't actually want to go back to war. One of the things that we were quite surprised at when we looked at this war was the extent of American demobilization between 1945 and 1950. And if you're like me, prior to sitting down to study this war for the first time, you would have thought that the modern global security infrastructure, with America at its heart of the free world, began in 1945, because that was the end of the Second World War, when American power peaked. But it's not true. America reduced its armed forces by 90% from 1945 to 1950. The troops were brought home. And there was a very strong sense in the United States and again in the United Kingdom that the world would never see a devastating war like the Second World War again. And I mean, most people agreed with that. Why would anyone be stupid enough to put their head in a noose and go back to war? And yet Kim Il-sung did. And he did so without understanding the commitment that the Republic of Korea had with America. And despite the fact that America was largely naked, I mean, during this period of time, the Americans were talking about removing the Marine Corps from the order of battle. I mean, it's really as dramatic as that. Can you imagine that? America without the Marine Corps. They came very, very close to ending it. So one of our conclusions was that the modern global security infrastructure that's protected us from the bad guys for a very long time actually began in Korea, not in the Second World War. So it started because Kim Il-sung made some very, very serious mistakes. It was a war of many kinds. It was, yes, a civil war. We worked very hard in the book to describe what we mean by that, because right from the early days of the war, the communists in the North and the global communist movement argued that North Korea was simply a civil war and foreign troops needed to leave. By foreign troops, they meant the Americans. And certainly lots of American leftish writers always argue that this was a civil war that America had no right or reason to be involved in. Interestingly enough, the left also believe that when there is a good war that needs to be fought, then the world needs to intervene, thinking about Bosnia and Herzegovina way back in the early 90s. It was an intra-national war. It was a war between two countries because, like it or not, those two parts of Korea that had been so sadly divided in 1945 for prosaic reasons, for reasons of disarming the Japanese, became solidified into two entirely separate states. And by 1947, the Republic of Korea, the South, was declared and recognized by the United Nations to be the true state of Korea. But so it was an international war. It was a war between two parts of Korea. It was an international war, obviously, because it involved 18 countries on the United Nations side and quite a number of countries on the north, at least three, possibly many more, because by 1950-51, members of the Warsaw Pact were also involved, providing pilots and equipment and so on. And for that reason, it was also a proxy war to a degree. It was a war between East and West. But one thing that Richard and I were really quite struck about, was the fact that it was a familial war. It was a war driven by one family. It was almost a gangster war. It's almost a narco war without the narcotics. Narco wars are wars between tribes of people trying to make lots of money. And that's really, Kim Il-sung was a narco lord in the 1950s without the narcotics. I mean, he might have done better had there been narcotics involved. And it's important to really understand the quite deep complexities of the war. It wasn't simply a limited war. It wasn't simply a proxy war. It wasn't simply a war between East and West. It had multiple layers, which confuses historians and anyone else. And for that reason, the historiography, so the story of the stories that are written about the war, the books and the histories, are deeply contested between left and right. If you go to look at what's been produced over the last 40 years in America, the majority of academic works present a very strongly leftist view of the Korean War, which is that America had no right to intervene. This was something that the Koreans should have been left to sort out for themselves. That the use of force by the West, by the United Nations, was wrong. And in this particular conversation, you need to be very clear about what you're trying to understand. And Richard and I came to some pretty blunt conclusions in our book. We decided that the First War for Korea, June to October 1950, was a righteous war that was fought for good reasons, it was proportionate in its actions, and it brought about success on the battlefield. And at that point, the United Nations should have left the country on its own with the status quo antebellum, the point at which the world had existed before the war began, reasserted. Instead, we then had a second war, which was foolishly planned, egregiously conducted. Was it egregiously conducted? Well, unfortunately, in the Second War for Korea, in terms of the way in which the Americans in particular used force, we come to the conclusion that much of the American force that was used, particularly from the air, was not morally supportable. It's quite a harsh judgment to make, and I'll let you read the book, but we are pretty uncompromising in our view that American air power, particularly B-29s, not dropping atomic bombs, but dropping very large amounts of conventional ammunition on effectively defenseless North Korean villages and towns, is not morally supportable. The reason why America got to where it was because Curtis LeMay, this very brilliant air power, he's not a theorist, he delivered American air power, realized between October 1944 and March 1945 that precision bombing from the air was a misnomer and would never achieve strategic results, had not achieved strategic results in Europe, and would not achieve strategic results in Japan. So in March 1945, under Curtis LeMay, America moved to an area bombing campaign, which removed 40% of most of Japan's cities. And when I say removed 40%, I mean killed 40% of the population of Japan's cities. Now, we can have a moral argument about whether that was right in proportion and so on in the context of a global war. And I have a particular view which is articulated in a book called A War of Empires, which is that it was right and proper because we had a war of civilizations underway, and the cost-benefit analysis in that engagement required quite significant steps to be taken to persuade the Japanese that they could not achieve success in the war by continuing to fight as they were fighting. But that doesn't mean it was right to lift and shift that entire strategy and plonk it onto North Korea from 1951 to 1953, where we had B-29 squadrons lifting off from Guam, seeking targets of opportunity in North Korea. In North Korea, in those 3 years of war, between 18 and 20% of the entire population was killed, most of it by American bombing. And this, we searched hard, Richard and I, when we were looking at this book, and we were sort of confronted by this moral bleakness. We looked very hard to find any substantive discussion in Washington about the rightness or the wrongness of B-29s seeking targets of opportunity. What's a target of opportunity? Anyone who is a soldier, airman, do you know what a target of opportunity is? I'll give you an example. In 1944, mosquito squadrons over Northwest Europe mounted what were known as rhubarb raids. And rhubarb raids were load up your mosquito, get across to France, and seek out targets of opportunity. Cyclists on the road, trains on the train tracks, cars on the road, bridges that are still standing, targets of opportunity, okay? It's in a particular area of operations. So you see what I mean. It's a tactical consideration. You're attacking individual targets that you haven't planned, you don't know are there, but might be there when you're overhead. You're launching B-29 squadrons, 16 aircraft, B-29s, largest bomber in the world, from Guam, and you're launching them across North Korea, looking for targets of opportunity. Cyclists on the roads, villages that aren't smoldering yet. 20% of North Korea's population died during this war. The closest possible country that suffered the same rate of destruction was Poland in the Second World War. So Poland and North Korea lost more people from their countries as a consequence of war in any war in the whole of history. So there is a moral bleakness about the war in North Korea that had Richard and I speechless on occasions when we considered the implications of what the United Nations and the United States was doing. And partly as a consequence of that moral bleakness, well, you can understand why it's highly contested, why politicians of left and right grapple with Korea and argue over it to this day. And I've mentioned the fact that there were 2 Korean wars. I've mentioned the fact that it was not limited. It certainly wasn't limited for the poor, benighted people of Korea who were forced to live under the terrible bombardment from the air and so on. Richard and I come to it's 120,000 words, believe it or not. We could have kept on writing, and we were considering writing another chapter on Vietnam because Korea is the bugle call for Vietnam. Korea began the Vietnam War. Vietnam was the next stage in an Asian war, of which Korea was the first. But there is always a point in books where you've got to stop because you guys won't read them. And we didn't go that next stage, but the final chapter is what we call reflections, which is, so what? What does this teach us, if anything, about how wars are started and how wars should end? The first thing is that the success of the Americans in particular in the First Korean War in October 1950 was a very close run thing. The Americans very, very nearly failed, and that was because they were not prepared for war. The parallels in 1950 with the British Army in 1918 were quite extraordinary. In 1940 rather, were quite extraordinary. Britain was not prepared for war in 1940. America wasn't prepared for war in 1950. Prepare for war. Don't assume that we're going to live in a period of perennial peace and that the sunlit uplands continue to stretch out beyond us, and that we have no predators looking out to attack us. Because I think everyone in this room will recognize that that's just utter stupidity. But I'm afraid we live in a political environment which actually does accept that, does think that we're on one of Winston Churchill's sunlit uplands, and it's going to be endlessly before us until the next war comes. Establish your campaign objectives. This will, if you establish your campaign objectives, what does victory mean? It will result in you saying, we've achieved our aims by defeating the North Korean army and re-establishing the status quo ante bellum. We don't need to rush in to North Korea and prod the Chinese bear. We've got a campaign objective. We know what victory means, and we've achieved it. None of that existed. David Petraeus and Andrew Roberts wrote a very good book the year before last called Conflict. There's a very good chapter on Korea which describes this, and we shamelessly lifted the argument, but it makes a lot of sense. So agree your strategy before you embark on the rush to the Yalu. Join a collective security club. Collective security is undervalued. If any of you think that the demise of NATO is a good thing, you need to sit down and read this book, because collective security is the only thing that's protecting you from that mad predator who's charging around causing mayhem in Eastern Europe. Collective security, the promise that we'll all stand together when the balloon goes up. And the final thing is my point about battle. Now, who would have thought that battle is actually very, very important? MacArthur lost confidence in his army and was very, very close to pushing some nuclear buttons in April 1951. And it was only the brilliance of his army, now led by Matthew B. Ridgway, with a brilliant British brigade, the 27th Brigade, that brought the whole war back from the brink. And on that note, you're going to have an opportunity now to recharge your glasses and wake up, and then we'll go to questions. Okay?